Okay, today's topic is citizenship and immigration. Citizenship is mentioned directly or indirectly a few times in the Constitution. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So this tells us that there are two main ways, two primary sources of citizenship. One is birthright, so those are people who are born in the United States, or they're born citizens. You can actually be born a citizen outside the United States. It's possible. Or you can be naturalized, and this is how an immigrant becomes a citizen, is naturalization. And Article 1, Section 8 says the Congress shall have power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. So Congress, not the president, Congress decides, well, the president can sign or veto the law, I guess, but Congress decides what the rules of naturalization will be. Now, one concept just to mention is dual citizenship. A dual citizen is a person who is considered a citizen by more than one nation. That person has dual citizenship. It is possible for a United States citizen to have dual citizenship. You could be born in the U.S. to a parent who is a citizen of a foreign country. Or you could be born in a different country to a parent who is a citizen here, and you could wind up with dual citizenship in one of those ways. Sometimes you could even have a grandparent who is a citizen of a foreign country and acquire citizenship in that country that way. So anyone who becomes a naturalized United States citizen is required to renounce any prior allegiance to other countries during the naturalization ceremony. So you have to swear that you renounce allegiance to other countries. But this renunciation is generally not considered renunciation of citizenship in those countries. The United States Department of State confirms on their website that a United States citizen can hold dual nationality. A United States citizen may naturalize in a foreign state without any risk to his or her United States citizenship. So if I wanted to become a citizen of Mexico, which is very hard to do, but I wanted to, and I somehow did, I wouldn't have to give up my United States citizenship to do it. The United States would still consider me a citizen here unless I specifically renounced it. I'd pretty much have to go to a U.S. embassy or consulate and tell them I renounce my citizenship. Otherwise, they would just assume that I mean to keep it. Or suppose I was a citizen of Mexico, and I had moved here, and I qualified for citizenship, and I became a United States citizen. The United States would not assume that I was renouncing my Mexican citizenship, right? They would assume, again, that I intended to just keep both, and they wouldn't make me choose one or the other. So the rights of citizens, basically, the right or the freedom to reside and work in the United States. So once you're a citizen, basically, you can't be deported. Everyone else can have that freedom to live here taken away and can lose their right to live here. The freedom to enter and leave the United States is very similar. Now, permanent residents, lawful permanent residents, are like the closest step for immigrants to citizenship who haven't gotten there yet, and they can come and go as they want. They can, so if you're a lawful permanent resident of the United States, but you want to go visit your family in Canada, you can come and go as you please. But you do have to maintain a residence in the United States, or they consider that you've renounced your lawful permanent residence and that you're now no longer entitled to reside here. But if you're a citizen, you don't have to maintain a residence in the United States. So for example, from about 2001 to 2003, I lived in Mexico. but I did not lose my citizenship, right, by doing that. I could stay as long as I wanted. I could have stayed there 20 years and not come back, and I would still be an American citizen whenever I decided I wanted to come back. But if you're a permanent resident, we call those green card holders, is what people normally say. If they leave and stay gone for months and months or years and years, they can lose their residency and not have the right to come back. Another right is voting. So voting for federal office in all 50 states and the District of Columbia is restricted to citizens only. But citizens are not compelled to vote. You don't have to vote if you don't want to. Non-citizens can vote in some local elections in very few places in the United States. Citizens have the freedom to stand for public office, meaning if you want to be in the U.S. House of Representatives, you have to be a citizen. If you want to run for election to be a United States Senator, you have to be a citizen. And most states have similar requirements. So if you want to be the governor of Texas, you have to be a United States citizen. Also, the right to apply for federal employment. There are many federal jobs where you have to be a citizen to qualify for that job. Now, duties. Here are some duties that citizens are expected to fulfill. One, jury duty. It's only imposed on citizens. If you're not a citizen, you don't have to do it. Military participation. Now, this one's actually kind of iffy because if you're a permanent resident or a citizen and you're a male, 18 or older, you can be drafted, theoretically. There's no draft today, but it could happen. And you could be required to participate in the military. Also, if you're a citizen, you have to pay taxes. And this one's a little tricky. You have to pay taxes even if you're living in a different country and earning income there. You have to pay taxes on your income wherever you are. So I didn't really have any income to speak of in Mexico, but I would have had to pay taxes on it if I had been making a lot of money. And last, the census. You have to respond to the census once every 10 years. But actually, even residents are required to respond to the census, so that's not just citizens. One benefit to being a citizen is consular protection outside the United States. If you're an American citizen and you're traveling abroad and you are arrested or detained by foreign authorities, you can request to speak to somebody from the U.S. Embassy or consulate, and that's probably the first thing you should do. If you are an American citizen and you're in Mexico or El Salvador or Germany or wherever, and you get in trouble, you get arrested, probably the first thing you should do is tell them you're an American citizen and ask to speak to your consulate. And they will give you advice. Maybe they'll give you a list of local attorneys who might help you, or depending on the situation, they might even intervene on your behalf and try to help you directly. A citizen has an increased ability to sponsor relatives living abroad. So you have an ability to help bring your relatives, get them visas so they can come to the United States. You can invest in United States real property, that means land, without, this says triggering the Foreign Investment and Real Property Tax Act. I don't care that you remember that name. But foreigners who invest in land in the United States might have to pay extra taxes, and a citizen doesn't. That's the gist of it. You can transmit to your United States citizenship to children born abroad. Now, so my wife and I are both American citizens. If we had a child in Mexico, our child would automatically be an American citizen, even though she's born in a different country. We would transmit that citizenship to her. Now, previously, my wife was not an American citizen, and if we had had a child in Mexico, it would have been slightly more complicated, but still it would have been possible even for one parent to transmit citizenship to the other. And there would just be conditions that the child would have to meet, and that I would have to meet. And I already mentioned this one, a benefit is protection from deportation. If you're an immigrant to the United States and you commit a crime, you could get yourself deported. If you're an American, you'll get sent to jail, possibly, but you won't be deported. You won't be kicked out of the country. A little bit about civic participation. A benefit of naturalization or citizenship is the ability to participate fully in the civic life of the country, meaning you can vote and you can serve in public office, whereas non-citizens generally can't. But again, civic participation is not required. You don't have to vote. You don't have to ever pay attention to politics or run for political office if you don't want to. A little bit more about birthright citizenship. So United States citizenship is usually acquired by birth when a child is born within the territory of the United States. So the territory of the United States consists of 50 U.S. states, the District of Columbia, that's Washington, D.C., the islands of Guam, Puerto Rico, the Northern Mariana Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Palmyra Atoll. One interesting exception from that, people born in the U.S. territory of Samoa are American nationals, but they're not considered citizens. There's a subtle distinction. Now, a little bit more about that. So our current understanding of the Constitution is this. The 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So that means all babies born in the United States enjoy United States citizenship, except those born to enemy aliens in wartime or the children of foreign diplomats. So if I was a diplomat working in the United States and my wife and I had a child, that child would not automatically be a U.S. citizen. If I was in a foreign army invading the United States and I had a child, that child would not be a United States citizen. But what if I'm an immigrant? What if I'm an immigrant here from Germany and I have a child here and my wife is also an immigrant, so we're in the same situation? Is our child a citizen? What? Yes. What if we're here illegally? What if we came here from Germany and our visa expired, but we never went back, so we're residing here in Texas illegally, and we have 2 children? Are our children U.S. citizens? Yes. All babies born here are citizens unless they're the babies of foreign diplomats or invaders, right? Military invaders. That's the current situation, the current standing of the law. Okay, a little bit more about naturalization. So again, Article 1, Section 8 said Congress has the power to establish an uniform rule of naturalization. So Congress can provide the rules, the laws, for acquisition of citizenship by persons not born in the United States. So people applying to become United States citizens must satisfy certain requirements. They must have been permanent residents for 5 years, or 3 if they're married to a U.S. citizen. They must be of good moral character, meaning no felony convictions. They must be of sound mind in the judgment of immigration officials. That's kind of vague. They must have a knowledge of the Constitution. They must be able to speak and understand English, unless they're elderly or disabled. And applicants must pass a citizenship test. This is a 10-question oral test, and they have to get 6 correct answers to receive a passing grade. I now want to mention the agencies of the United States federal government that oversee immigration and that sort of thing. So first, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, that's USCIS, is an agency of the United States Department of Homeland Security that administers the country's naturalization and immigration system. So the USCIS processes immigrant visa petitions, naturalization applications, asylum applications, applications for adjustment of status, that's green cards, and refugee applications. There are 2 key points in an immigrant's path to American citizenship where the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services are crucial. That's when the immigrant first becomes a permanent resident, and then when they're ready to begin the formal naturalization process. So they have to go through legal stages of applying to the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Actually, first they have to apply for a visa, generally. Then they have to apply for permanent residence. Then they have to apply for naturalization. I think I mentioned this already, but a lawful permanent resident is eligible to become a U.S. citizen after holding the permanent resident card for at least 5 continuous years, with no trips out of the country of 180 days or more. But if the lawful permanent resident marries a U.S. citizen, then eligibility for U.S. citizenship is shortened to 3 years, as long as the resident has been living with the spouse continuously for 3 years, and the spouse has been a resident of the United States for at least 3 years. Next, I want to mention ICE, the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. This is a federal law enforcement agency under the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Its stated mission is to protect the United States from the cross-border crime and illegal immigration that threaten national security and public safety. ICE has 2 primary law enforcement components. One is called Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI. And the other is called Enforcement and Removal Operations, or ERO. HSI is focused on the disruption of transnational crime, so I'm not going to talk about it very much. It's more like the FBI. It's more of a criminal investigation unit, even though it's part of ICE. But ERO, Enforcement and Removal Operations, is responsible for the apprehension, detention, and removal of illegal immigrants. So when it comes to immigration issues, that's the group that we think of the most. So Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO, primarily deals with the deportation and removal of undocumented non-citizens. It maintains custodial facilities to detain people that are illegally present in the United States. And in interior offices, meaning inside in the interior of the country, away from the border, ERO officers primarily conduct targeted enforcement operations to apprehend aliens engaged in serious criminal activity. For example, in fiscal year 2020, 90% of aliens apprehended by ERO had criminal convictions or pending charges at the time of their administrative arrest. So in the interior of the country, away from the borders, and that here would be considered in Athens the interior of the country. If ICE is going after somebody, there's a 90% chance that that person is wanted for serious crimes, like murder, theft, burglary. On the border, they just try to catch whoever's coming across illegally. So in 2020, arrest statistics included 1,800 homicide-related offenses, 1,600 kidnappings, 3,800 robberies, 37,000 assaults, and 10,000 sex crimes. At the border, ERO officers receive and detain illegal immigrants apprehended by Border Patrol. And at the border, these illegal immigrants have significantly lower levels of criminal history than those arrested in the interior. Okay. I'm going to skip this page. Another part of the federal government important for immigration concerns is the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, kind of popularly known as the Border Patrol. This is the largest federal law enforcement agency of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and it's our primary border control organization. It is charged with regulating and facilitating international trade, collecting import duties, and enforcing U.S. regulations, including trade, customs, and immigration. The CBP has a workforce of over 58,000 employees. They inspect and examine passengers and cargo at 328 ports of entry to the United States. There are over 21,000 Border Patrol agents who protect and patrol 1,900 miles of border with Mexico and 5,000 miles of border with Canada. There are 1,000 or more air and marine interdiction agents who try to prevent illegal entry by air and water. And there are 2,500 employees in the Customs and Border Protection Agency who collect over $30 billion annually in entry duties and taxes through the enforcement of trade and tariffs laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a United States federal law signed by President Chester A. Arthur in 1882, prohibiting all immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. The law excluded merchants, teachers, students, travelers, and diplomats. Building on an earlier act, which banned Chinese women from migrating to the United States, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the only law ever implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. The act was initially intended to last for 10 years, but was renewed and strengthened in 1892 with the Geary Act and made permanent in 1902. The law remained in force until the passage of the Magnuson Act in 1943, which repealed the exclusion and allowed 105 Chinese immigrants to enter the United States each year. The Immigration Act of 1924 is next. This act is also called the Johnson-Reed Act, and it includes two other acts, the Asian Exclusion Act and the National Origins Act. This was a United States federal law that prevented immigration from Asia and set quotas on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, meaning Europe, Asia, Africa. Additionally, it created the U.S. Border Patrol. So this act set a total immigration quota of 165,000 for countries outside the Western Hemisphere. So a total of 165,000 immigrants per year would be allowed from Europe, Africa, and Asia. And this was an 80% reduction from the average before World War I. In other words, before World War I, we had an average of about 1 million a year, almost, from Europe mostly. And this reduced that by 80%. It established quotas. So what it said was that the number of immigrants who would be allowed from a certain country would be a percentage of the people in the 1890 U.S. Census who were from that country. So just to use make-believe numbers, originally the percentage was 3%, and then it was 2%. So if you look at the 1890 census, and you say, well, according to the 1890 census, there are 100 Italians in the United States. People were born in Italy. And there were many, many, many more than that, but I'm using make-believe numbers just to explain the process. You would say, okay, 3% of that is 3. So since there were 100 Italians in 1890, we'll let 3 Italians in each year, right, based on that percentage. And this, there were actually more like 1 million Italians. I'm just using make-believe math. This was meant to drastically reduce the number of Italians who would be allowed to come each year, and Greeks and Russians and so forth. And if eventually that number is reduced to 2%. So they came up with 2% of whatever the number of immigrants was in 1890. This system lasted for about 40 years, and it was intended to reduce immigration, especially from certain countries in Europe, Italy, Greece, Russia, places like that. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 changed the system. This is also sometimes called the Hart-Celler Act. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson. It abolished the national origins formula. So this thing about a certain percentage of people from a certain year on the census, it threw all that out. It removed de facto discrimination against Southern and Eastern Europeans, Asians, as well as other non-Western and Northern European ethnic groups. And in opening the door to immigrants from other groups, this act significantly altered immigration demographics in the United States. Now, this chart here shows you what I mean. In 1960, before this act, 75% of foreign-born Americans were from Europe. So of the Americans in 1960 who were born in other countries, 75% of them were born in Europe. But you can see that number gets lower and lower and lower and lower and lower. In 2010, this chart, of all the foreign-born people, all the immigrants in the United States, only 12% of them come from Europe today. 88% of them come from somewhere else. Latin America, Africa, Asia, mostly. So, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 created a 7-category preference system that gives priority to relatives and children of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents, professionals and other individuals with special skills, and refugees. The Act maintained per country and total immigration limits, but included a provision exempting immediate relatives of U.S. citizens from numerical restrictions. The Act also set a numerical limit on immigration from the Western Hemisphere for the first time in U.S. history. So for the first time, there were limits placed on how many people could get visas from Mexico, Canada, Peru, Western Hemisphere countries. About 20 years later, the next big legal reform is the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. You can see President Reagan signing the bill here. This act did lots of things, but there are two really important things I want to point out. First, it required employers to attest to the employee's immigration status and made it illegal to knowingly hire or recruit unauthorized immigrants. So now, in 1986, for the first time, it becomes federal law that it's illegal to hire an illegal immigrant. You can only hire a legal immigrant or an American citizen. Another thing that was really important about this act, this reform in 1986, it legalized undocumented migrants who entered the United States before January 1, 1982, and who had resided in the United States continuously if they could prove that they were not guilty of any crime. They hadn't, been in jail for robbery or, assault or things like that. They could prove that they had been in the country since before 1982, and they had to have a minimal knowledge of U.S. history and government and the English language. And it meant minimal, not mastery, but they had to be able to speak English at least a little bit in order to pass a history and government test. This reform was meant to give amnesty to many people, several million people who were here illegally, but it was also meant to prevent more illegal immigration, partly by making it a crime to hire illegal immigrants, but that part didn't work. For about 3 years, there was a temporary decrease in illegal immigration, and then it returned to previous levels, and this reform, had no effect on illegal immigration. Now I want to talk about a few cases in the Supreme Court that are interesting and important regarding immigration. This case, Chi Lung versus Freeman from 1876, originated in San Francisco in 1875 when 22 women arrived in a steamboat from China. They were examined by an immigration commissioner who identified them as lewd and debauched women. What does that mean? He was calling them prostitutes. The captain of the ship, according to San Francisco's law, or maybe it was California law, had an option of paying a $500 bond per woman, which was a lot of money in those days, to allow her to land, or taking her back. But the captain refused to pay the bond, and he kept the women on board the ship. They couldn't disembark, they couldn't get off the ship. San Francisco wouldn't let them, because it was accusing them of basically being prostitutes. And the ship captain refused to pay the bond that would allow them to disembark to get off the ship. They issued out a writ of habeas. They sued, basically in a San Francisco court or a California state court, and they were taken off the ship and they were put in detention in San Francisco. And they were ordered to be deported back to China by local authorities. They appealed the decision to the California Supreme Court, which upheld the law that required them to have a bond paid if they were to be disembarked, and that ordered them to be deported. They appealed that decision to the United States Supreme Court, and the United States Supreme Court ruled on behalf of Chi Lung and the Chinese woman. The Supreme Court said that these state and local laws regulating immigration from China, or immigration period, were unconstitutional, and it was the federal government that had the responsibility to make immigration laws, not states, not local governments. And so the women won their case. This is a very important precedent for saying that the federal government would prevail over state and local governments in immigration matters. Now I'm going to jump about 100 years ahead. Another very interesting case originated right here in East Texas. It's called Plyler versus Doe. And this case was about a Texas law from 1975 that said that children who were illegal aliens, children who were not U.S. citizens and not legal aliens, legal immigrants, could not go to school in Texas for free, not to public school. They were not entitled to a free public education in Texas. So school districts across Texas could either kick those students out and just not let them come to school at all, or make them pay tuition. And Tyler said, if you aren't a citizen and you aren't a legal immigrant, you can come to school if you pay a $1,000 a year tuition. Well, there were 4 families. They were Mexican-American families, about 16 children, and they decided they couldn't afford the tuition, and they sued in a United States court in Tyler. The court ruled in their favor. It got appealed up to the Supreme Court, and in 1982, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the children. It said that they have the right to equal protection of the laws, guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, and that this Texas law violated their right to equal protection. So in other words, any child, whether legal immigrant or illegal immigrant, whether citizen or non-citizen, is entitled to a free public education in Texas or in anywhere else in the United States. One more law, last law, that's controversial and interesting and important. Arizona versus United States. I wrote 2010 on this slide. I think I should have written 2012. Sorry for the typo there. It's not important, but it's a typo. So this was a Supreme Court case involving a law in Arizona called Senate Bill 1070. This was a state law that wanted to enforce federal immigration laws. And the question was whether or not this state law conflicted with the federal government immigration laws and it had to be struck down. So you remember in San Francisco in 1875, the Supreme Court said your state and local immigration laws are no good. It has to be federal law. And so this is a similar issue. The court struck down 3 provisions of the Arizona law. 1 required legal immigrants to carry registration documents at all times. So the court said that's unconstitutional. Another allowed state police to arrest any individual suspected of being an illegal immigrant. Wait. Yeah, that's right. And another made it a crime for an illegal immigrant to search for or hold the job in the state. So these were all struck down. But all of the justices in the Supreme Court agreed to uphold a provision of the law allowing Arizona State Police to investigate the immigration status of an individual who was already stopped, detained, or arrested if there was reasonable suspicion that the individual was in the country illegally. So if the Arizona police had stopped someone for speeding or for some other crime, and they had reasonable suspicion that the person was in the country illegally, they could detain that person in order to investigate it. And that part was upheld. So last, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about immigration today. So today, on average, there are more than 1 million immigrants who arrive in the United States each year. And this is legal immigrants, right? This chart breaks it down by decade, going back over 100 years. So in the decade from 2010 to 2019, the average was just over 1 million per year. From 2000 to 2009, again, the average was just over 1 million per year. There was a slight dip around 2019, 2020, 2021, mostly because of COVID, I think, and immigration numbers went down. But the trend for the last 20 years or so has been 1 million plus per year. This chart, I think, is very interesting because it shows you that in 2020, somewhere around 45 million residents of the United States were immigrants. They were born in some country other than the United States. And as a percentage of the US population, they were about 14%, somewhere around there, if I'm reading that chart correctly. This was, as a percentage, about as high as it's ever been in US history before. You can see around 1890, it was 15%. Around 1910, it was 15%. As an absolute number, then 45 million immigrants in the US today is the largest number that we've ever had. This chart shows some of the same information, but with projections into the future. If trends continue, it's saying by 2050, there will be about 65 million immigrants in the United States. By 2060, about 69 million immigrants in the United States. And in 2060, that will be about 17.1% of the American population. So a little less than 1 out of every 5 people here will be an immigrant, if present trends continue. Where do the immigrants come from? I already hinted at this. They no longer come mostly from Europe. In 1960, according to this chart, this is slightly different numbers than what I gave you a few minutes ago, but close enough. This says 84% of immigrants were either from Europe or from Canada and or North America. That's because it's including Canada. That's why it's different. And notice only 6% were from Mexico. Only 3% were from other parts of Latin America, and only 4% were from Asia. So most immigrants were from Europe, and then also from Canada. But that number from Europe and Canada goes down, 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 and the other numbers go up, up, up. So in 2018, only 13% of our immigrants are from Europe, but 28% are from Asia, 25% from Latin America, 25% from Mexico. At one point, in 2000 and 2010, the largest number of immigrants, legal immigrants, right? We're not even considering illegal immigrants, were from Mexico. More from Mexico than from the rest of Latin America combined, more from Mexico than from all of Asia, and more from Mexico than from all of Europe combined, all the European countries. But the Mexican immigration has declined a little bit in comparison to Asia, for example, and now, over the last 3 or 4 years, most of our immigrants seem to be coming from Asia. Now, a word about illegal immigrants. They came up with the Plyler versus Doe case, so a little bit about that. So, according to this chart from the Pew Research Center, the peak for illegal immigration around 2006 or 2007 was that there were 12.2 million illegal immigrants in the United States. And this Pew data was from 2017, 2018, And it said that that number had declined to about 10.5 million. And today you hear people say there are 10.5 million, maybe 11 million unauthorized immigrants or illegal immigrants in the United States. That makes up 23% of the overall population of foreign-born residents. Right? So 77% of the foreign-born residents in the United States are lawful immigrants, 23% are unlawful immigrants. Now, I want to point out that immigrants, legal immigrants and illegal immigrants, don't have the same access to American public benefits that everybody else does. I mentioned the Plyler versus Doe case where illegal immigrant school children were told they do have a right to a free public education, but undocumented immigrants, including DACA holders, are ineligible to receive most federal public benefits, such as SNAP, which is food stamps, Medicaid, supplemental security income, temporary assistance for needy families. Undocumented immigrants are ineligible for health care subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, but illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants are eligible for some benefits, for example, emergency Medicaid, supplemental nutritional programs for women, infants, and children, emergency treatment in hospital emergency rooms, and things like that. What about legal immigrants, lawful permanent residents? The general rule is that a lawful permanent resident, not a citizen, is not eligible for federal benefits like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, until they've been here for 5 years. And then after the 5-year period, now they become eligible. If it's Social Security, they have to have the 40 quarters of work, just like citizens do, and then they can be eligible for Social Security. Now, some questions that people debate nowadays that I wanted to just mention, because you see questions like this in the news all the time. Should the U.S. grant amnesty and a path to citizenship to some or all illegal immigrants? Should the U.S. allow more or fewer people the opportunity to immigrate to the United States? Should the U.S. have an open door policy or an open border for immigrants? Should it be easier or harder to become a U.S. citizen? Should only U.S. citizens have constitutional rights? Should immigrants be eligible for welfare, Social Security benefits, Medicaid or Medicare? Should illegal immigrants, illegal aliens be protected by the Constitution? Actually, I already said that. Should they be eligible for government benefits like food stamps, Social Security, free housing, Medicaid or Medicare? You find these questions being debated in the news constantly, and I'll show you now just a few examples. So a few days ago, Chuck Schumer, who is the Senate Majority Leader, called for legal amnesty for every illegal alien present in the United States, including a pathway to citizenship. He said, now more than ever, we're short of workers. We have a population that's not reproducing on its own with the same level that it used to. The only way we're going to have a great future in America is if we welcome and embrace immigrants. The dreamers and all of them, because our ultimate goal is to help the dreamers, but get a path to citizenship for all 11 million or however many undocumented there are here. So that's the leader of the United States Senate, and he wants amnesty plus citizenship for everybody who's here illegally. Here's another article this is from a little over a year ago, but this says the census shows the U.S. needs to increase, I cut off the increase word, immigration by a lot. So the idea here, I'm just quoting from the article, economists broadly agree that population growth fuels economic growth in wealthy countries, but recently released census figures show the U.S. population was 331.5 million people, an increase of just 7.4% between 2010 and 2020, the lowest rate since the 1930s. Projections suggest that unless current trends change, those numbers could continue to diminish dramatically over the next 2 to 3 decades, with the population growing by just 78 million by 2060. So in other words, the population of the United States isn't growing like it used to, and you need population growth to drive economic growth, and so we need to have more immigrants. If we get more immigrants, the population will grow and the economy will grow as well. How many more immigrants could we get if we wanted to? Well, this chart says, this is from a Gallup poll that was done about 4 years ago, and it interviewed people all over the world, and it estimated that over 750 million of them would immigrate to another country if they could. They just asked people all over Asia, Africa, all over the world, Latin America. They said, if you could move permanently to another country, would you do so? And the estimate is 750 million of them would if they could. And where would they go? The number one destination was the United States. 1 out of 5 of those 750 million people said they would come to the United States if they could. So right now, today, according to this Gallup poll, there's somewhere around 158 million people who would move here if they had the chance. So, should we let them, is the question. Last, I asked this question about immigrants being eligible for food stamps, Social Security benefits, Medicaid and Medicare. And I said, what about illegal immigrants? This article from a few months ago is about illegal immigrants who happen to live in Illinois. And it says, with Congress gridlocked, advocates say it's up to state and local lawmakers to protect the undocumented elderly. The woman pictured here, being hugged there in the middle, is Veronica Ortega. She's 51 years old. She immigrated from Mexico over 20 years ago with her husband and her 2 children. The 2 children now are in the DACA program, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So they are not permanent residents, they are not citizens, but they have protection from deportation and they have work permits. But she and her husband do not. They are not permanent residents, they're not lawful residents. They have no path to citizenship. They work about 50 hours apiece at factories in the suburbs of Chicago. But the point of the article is they won't qualify for Social Security or Medicare or food stamps. And the article says, since the federal government doesn't want to give illegal immigrants access to these social programs, states like Illinois need to step up and make it available. It says nationwide, about 1 million undocumented immigrants will turn 65 by 2030. And by 2040, that number will more than double. That means every year over the next few decades, thousands of undocumented seniors will be working to the bone without being able to retire, in desperate need of immediate and long-term health care, frantically searching for safe, affordable housing. So this article says immigrants, including illegal immigrants, should be eligible for all of these federal benefits. And that's a debate that you constantly hear today.